The era of Queen Victoria coincided with the assassinations of Russian Tsar Alexander II, Italian King Umberto I, and two American presidents, Lincoln and Garfield. But the British ruler herself, who became a symbol of an entire era, managed to outwit death 7 times. At the time of her death in 1901, Victoria had been on the throne longer than any other monarch in British history. She ascended the throne as a young girl and reigned for 63 years, a time of colossal industrial, technological, and social upheavals. But today, it is hard to imagine how history might have turned out if even one of the 7 people who shot at the ruler of a vast empire had been a little more accurate. In an era when monarchs were constantly targeted by successful assassins, the British Queen escaped death under circumstances so dramatic that they seem like the plot of a Hollywood thriller. And what is most striking is Victoria's absolute composure, which turned every assassination attempt into an opportunity to further strengthen the people's love. Historian and BBC podcast author Dr. Bob Nicholson notes that the main reason for the frequent attacks on the Queen in the early years of her reign was her, by today's standards, rather alarming openness. What's truly striking is how often she traveled in an open carriage, Nicholson explains. There were no modern security measures in place. The carriage would roll slowly through the dense crowd, and anyone could literally reach out and touch the Queen. It was within arm's reach. A few guards would ride ahead, but that was far from resembling proper security. And the most amazing thing is that even after a series of assassination attempts, she continued her travels. Victoria's routes were regularly published in the Court Circular, so potential assassins didn't even need to track her down. They knew exactly where and when she would appear. The Queen understood the risks, but it was fundamentally important for her to restore the connection with the people who had grown disillusioned with the monarchy under her predecessors. She deliberately went into the crowd, knowing that an assassin might be waiting for her there. The motives and personalities of the attackers were strikingly different. From vain teenagers craving fame to mentally ill people and desperate unemployed individuals. But they all faced the same fate: swift justice. The first assassination attempt took place on June 10, 1840, when Victoria was 4 months pregnant with her first child. The 21-year-old Queen and her husband, Prince Albert, were taking an evening stroll in an open phaeton near Hyde Park. Suddenly, 18-year-old unemployed waiter Edward Oxford stepped out from the jubilant crowd on Constitution Hill. He drew a dueling pistol and fired at the carriage. Albert grabbed his wife's hands in horror, but Victoria merely smirked, deciding that someone was shooting at birds. When the carriage slowed down, Oxford drew a second pistol and fired again. The bullet whistled past, literally a few centimeters from the Queen's head. Unharmed, Victoria immediately ordered the coachman to continue driving in order to demonstrate her fearlessness to the crowd. Oxford was instantly subdued by passers-by. During the search, they found letters describing the fictional secret society Young England, a product of a teenager's fantasies fueled by a desire for notoriety. At the trial, the police failed to prove that the pistols were loaded with bullets rather than just gunpowder. As a result, Oxford was found not guilty on the grounds of insanity, which infuriated Victoria beyond description. In her diary, she called him very foolish, but certainly not insane. Oxford spent 24 years in the psychiatric hospitals Bedlam, and Broadmoor, where he learned languages and learned to play the violin, after which he was deported to Australia. There he changed his name to John Freeman, married a widow with 2 children, and became a respected church warden and journalist. The second attack, which occurred at the end of May 1842, served as proof of Victoria's steely character. Returning from an evening walk along the Mall, Prince Albert noticed a man in the crowd whom he later described as a small, dark, unattractive radical. The stranger pointed a pistol at them, but did not fire and disappeared into the crowd. The police and ministers begged the Queen not to leave the palace until the shooter was found. But Victoria made an unprecedented decision. The next day, she deliberately set out for a walk along the same route, acting as a living bait to lure out the killer. At the same time, she categorically forbade her ladies-in-waiting from accompanying her, so as not to put their lives at risk. The plan worked. On the same Constitution Hill, 19-year-old failed carpenter John Francis stepped out of the crowd again and fired. And again, he missed. Francis was captured and sentenced to death for treason. However, after a tearful letter from the young man's father, received at the last minute, Victoria showed mercy. The execution was commuted to exile in Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania. Francis spent many years in hard labor, describing them as an abyss of poverty and suffering, but eventually received a pardon after 14 years, had 9 children, and died in 1885 from tuberculosis. Less than 2 months had passed since Francis's arrest when the Queen once again found herself in the crosshairs. This time, the attacker was 17-year-old John Bean, who suffered from a severe spinal curvature. His height barely reached 152 centimeters. Having fled from the cruelty of his older brothers, Bean found himself on the street in complete despair. On July 3, 1842, he joined the crowd near Buckingham Palace. When the royal carriage appeared, Bean raised the rusty pistol and pulled the trigger. There was only a dry click. The weapon misfired. The most absurd part of this story is that a passerby grabbed Bean and dragged him to the police, but they refused to arrest him, citing a lack of evidence. Only when the witness brought the pistol to the station did the police launch a chaotic raid on all the hunchbacked teenagers in London. At the trial, Bean admitted that he hadn't even aimed at the Queen. He was simply tired of life and wanted to go to prison. The judge sentenced him to only 18 months in prison. Bean's life turned out tragically. Despite working as a jeweler and having 2 marriages, he couldn't endure the physical and mental torment, and in 1882, took his own life by taking a lethal dose of opium. After the incident with Bean, Victoria had 7 relatively peaceful years. Prince Albert even secured the adoption of a special law that reduced the punishment for such demonstrative attacks to 7 years of hard labor and flogging, in order to deprive the criminals of the halo of martyrs. However, on May 26, 1849, the law was put to the test. Irish immigrant William Hamilton, who had fled to London to escape the Great Famine, was desperate to find work. Repeating the path of his predecessors, he lay in wait for Victoria's carriage on the same ill-fated Constitution Hill and fired a shot. Fortune was once again on the monarch's side. Although there were rumors about Hamilton's connection with Irish revolutionaries, the investigation led to a more mundane conclusion. He simply wanted to be sent to an Australian colony at the state's expense, so as not to die of hunger. His wish came true. After serving 7 years of hard labor, he was sent on a prison ship to Gibraltar, and then to Fremantle, Western Australia. Robert Pate's attack, which occurred on June 27, 1850, was the only instance in which Queen Victoria sustained a real physical injury. Unlike previous marginal figures, Pate was a wealthy gentleman and a former officer in the 10th Hussar Regiment. He was dismissed from service due to progressive schizophrenia. He was known for spending hours marching around Hyde Park, brandishing a cane. When Victoria was leaving her uncle's mansion on Piccadilly, Pate rushed towards her and struck her on the head with all his might, using a heavy cane with a massive brass tip. "I felt myself being forcefully thrown to the left of the carriage," the Queen wrote in her diary. "My hat was crushed, and I felt a huge bleeding bruise on the right side of my forehead, fortunately just above my temple and eye." Despite the serious injury, Victoria demonstrated iron will. To reassure the nation, she appeared at the Royal Opera House that same evening, receiving thunderous applause from the audience. Pate was sentenced to 7 years of hard labor in Tasmania, after which he married an heiress and even returned to London. A long 22 years passed. During this time, Victoria experienced the greatest tragedy of her life, the death of her beloved Albert in 1861. Consumed by grief, the ruler almost completely disappeared from public life for a decade. However, in 1872, she attended a grand procession through London. In the jubilant crowd, 17-year-old Arthur O'Connor, the great-nephew of the leader of the radical Chartist movement, was hiding. His plan was bold: to hold a gun to the Queen's head and force her to sign a decree releasing Irish political prisoners. Having missed Victoria near the cathedral, 2 days later, O'Connor climbed over the fence of Buckingham Palace. When the carriage drove into the courtyard, the teenager rushed towards it with a pistol, but he didn't manage to reach the Queen. He was knocked down in a flash by John Brown, a loyal Scottish servant and a close friend of Her Majesty. O'Connor was subjected to ridicule from the press and was sentenced to only a year of hard labor. Victoria was outraged by the leniency of the sentence, and the authorities persuaded the young man to go to Australia. Less than a year later, he returned to England and headed straight to the palace, hoping to be killed by the police. He spent the rest of his life in shelters. The last assassination attempt took place in 1882. The 63-year-old Queen had already been on the throne for 45 years. Roderick Maclean, a man from the middle class, lost his mind after a severe head injury. Suffering from persecution mania, he couldn't find a job, lived on his sister's handouts, and was manically obsessed with the color blue and the number 4. Offended by the whole world and blaming old lady Mrs. Wick for his troubles, Maclean bought a revolver in Portsmouth and went to Windsor railway station. When the Queen was getting into her carriage near the station, Maclean drew his weapon and fired. The bullet missed its target for a rather comical reason. At that very moment, a crowd of students from the prestigious Eton College attacked the shooter. Armed only with their usual tightly rolled umbrellas, the school children began to beat the attacker so furiously that he had to be rescued. At the trial, Maclean was found not guilty by reason of insanity. Queen Victoria, utterly tired of the fact that people who had attempted to harm her avoided the gallows thanks to their diagnoses, forced the government to change the wording of the law to guilty but insane. Maclean, meanwhile, ended his days in the Broadmoor Psychiatric Clinic. Each of these assassination attempts could have radically changed the course of British history. But instead, they only strengthened Queen Victoria's character, transforming her from a vulnerable target into an unshakable monarchical symbol.